How does one redefine masculinity in the digital era following Gamergate? Director Cory Barlog ponders this question in 2018's God of War, which released to wide acclaim. Simultaneously, scholars have begun to examine how video games act as a media apparatus that redefines and reinforces hegemonic patriarchy. The God of War franchise has long been emblematic of hegemonic and toxic masculinity, an issue that Barlog and other members of the development team wanted to address directly. God of War follows an older Kratos years after destroying Greece. At some point he meets the character Faye and they have a son Atreus. The game begins after Faye's death, which acts as a catalyst for the game's primary objective, taking her ashes and spreading them across the highest peak in all the realms, as per her final wishes. In this talk, I showcase how God of War's music, narrative, and gameplay serve to mediate and interrogate performances of hegemonic and toxic masculinities, taking steps towards rehabilitation that may eventually lead to its complete abolition. In order to analyze the semiotics of gender and masculinity in God of War, I draw from Iain Hart's theory of ludomusicological semiotics, where meaning is communicated through a twofold semiosis, a semiotics of initial composition and a semiotics of gameplay. From interviews with and writings by Barlog and composer Bear McCreary, a set of musical experience potentials are created aiming to redeem Kratos and examine how toxic masculinity hurts us and those around us. To do this, however, it's important to establish what we mean by masculinities. Masculinities are a slippery concept that changes depending on historical, social, and geographic context. I draw my working definition of masculinities from 2018's Masculinities in Play, edited by Nicholas Taylor and Gerald Voorhees, and Stephen Conway's 2020 article Poisonous Pantheons, God of War and Toxic Masculinity. Both these sources take generally constructivist, plural approaches to conceptions of masculinities that accounts for the social, economic, geographic, and cultural influences that inform various masculine performances. For Taylor and Voorhees, masculinities are a media apparatus, constantly in flux. Media texts, technologies, and institutions are foundational in communicating contemporary formations of power and knowledge, as well as providing the material and institutional conditions for masculine subjects to be shaped. Masculinity as an apparatus, then, is a machine comprised of and connecting texts, technologies, contexts, policies, etc. to its dual projects of, quote, concretizing a sex-based hierarchy and directing the energies, desires, and efforts of masculine subjects towards state-sanctioned violence in the pursuit of its projects of domination. Stephen Conway takes a more constructivist position that context is an important factor in understanding identity, behavior, and morality, acknowledging the possibility of change in one's character, which is influenced by environmental and social relationships. This idea of change permeates the story and world of God of War, especially regarding change through social relationships. It is helpful to describe a hegemonic masculinity, defined by R.W. Connell as the common-sense recitation of masculinity instructed and performed on an everyday basis in society versus alternative masculinities, which may exist within any social, cultural formation and varying degrees of contested states. Simply put, hegemonic masculinity is the idealized notion of manhood at any given historical moment. This provides a foundation for the analysis of performances of masculinity within video games, as games are media built around concepts of repetition and performance. The God of War franchise is among the most culturally prolific video games to come out of the 2000s. The main character Kratos became the mascot for Sony in the West, equivalent to Mario for Nintendo and Master Chief for Microsoft. If one word could describe Kratos, it would be rage, an emotion that has become intertwined with gaming culture. David Jaffe, original director of God of War, claims in a commentary that
the main goal for the character in the game was always to create someone that looked really brutal and really nasty and really violent. And I think he achieves the greater purpose, which is to give players a character that they can play who really does let them just go nuts and unleash the nasty fantasies they have in their head.
I really like the idea of painting Kratos as this sort of animalistic creature, and he was a badass on the battlefield, he was a badass in the bedroom.
Throughout the first trilogy, Kratos mutilates, dismembers, and massacres his way through hordes of enemies and innocents on a quest for revenge against the gods of Olympus, leading to Zeus, his father. In addition, all three of the primary games in the trilogy feature a mini-game where Kratos demonstrates his aggressive heterosexuality by sleeping with women, where his grunts for combat are turned into grunts of a sexual nature. The final game in the Greek arc, God of War Ascension, released in 2013, a year before Gamergate became a mainstream campaign. The events of Gamergate have been extensively documented and discussed in academic circles, as well as by those who were victims of their harassment. The fallout of this event continues to permeate game development discourse, particularly how concepts of masculinity contribute to the event. Development for God of War began between 2013 and early 2014, meaning that most of the game's development took place after Gamergate and was likely influenced by the rage-filled rhetoric used by the most aggressive harassers perpetuating the campaign. This problematic background meant that many were skeptical of the attempt to rehabilitate Kratos, feelings that could be summed up as,
Will the irredeemable Kratos redeem himself? Will they even try?
No!
examining the semiotics of video games and their music provide unique challenges not found in film and concert music. The interactive nature of games allows for a multitude of what Theo van Leeuwen calls experience potentials. These experience potentials are narrowed and filtered through the game design and development process, allowing for an intended aesthesis that the player may or may not experience. The semiotics of initial composition most closely reflects semiotic processes of non-interactive musical media. A producer or producers create a text that is received by the player. It involves all the creative acts up until the point where the player loads the game. Can a man with a toxic, damaging past redeem himself? Can he be given a second chance? These are questions that Cory Barlog wanted to address directly in God of War. Gamergate was ever present in gaming circles from late 2013 through 2015, meaning that some of the most important initial creative decisions were made during the peak of male gamers expressing their Kratosian rage. Fatherhood is a core theme in God of War. Cory Barlog has discussed how his own experience as a father to his son played a major influence on the game's development. This lesson that I hoped to pass on to my son, that the concepts of strength and emotional vulnerability are not warring or diametrically opposed. Indeed, the score to God of War aids in this lesson, utilizing character themes to musically depict moments of both strength and emotional vulnerability. Bear McCreary writes extensively about the compositional process on his website, providing insight into the judgments that McCreary made during the poesis of the game score. He writes that he set out to create a score containing several themes which would elicit specific responses from the player when they appeared in the game. Just as Cory Barlog's relationship with his son influenced the direction of the story and gameplay, his relationship with his daughter became a central lens through which he viewed Kratos and Atreus' relationship, and subsequently shaped nearly every musical decision he made. The influence of Barlog's son and McCreary's daughter on the portrayal of Atreus introduces interesting implications for gendered readings of the game's narrative. The major twist in God of War is the revelation that Faye was a frost giant who wanted to name their child Loki. Those familiar with Norse mythology know that Loki has historically been depicted as both male and female, paralleling the influences of the creator's children on the game. The two musical themes most important to the narrative for God of War are Kratos and Faye's themes. These two themes are deeply intertwined, both within the narrative and the game's development. The first theme composed for God of War was Faye's theme, with Bear McCreary initially composing it for Kratos. The theme is a highly lyrical waltz in D minor. McCreary eventually decided that this theme was too sad and lyrical for Kratos, and put it aside. Although Faye never appears in the story, her presence is felt throughout the musical score. Across the game, her theme is heard, as though she is still with Kratos and Atreus despite having passed on. Considering Faye's theme too sad and lyrical for Kratos shows how the developers grappled with how to represent a changing hypermasculine character. McCreary reveals that he wanted Kratos' theme to communicate vital and often conflicting character traits, strength and masculinity, wisdom and vulnerability. Bombastic, powerful instrumentation combines with beautiful melodies and harmonies to yield what I hope is a memorable and iconic theme that adapts and evolves to guide the player through Kratos' emotional journey. Here we can see how a composer's own web of interpretants influences the musical significations they choose to utilize within the game score. Austin, writing in Masculinities and Play, discusses how orchestration often plays a key role in gendering through music. The instruments most often used for Kratos' theme are low strings, percussion, and brass, all instruments with a long history of masculine gendering. This reflects Kratos' Spartan past without referencing any music from prior games. However, his theme also appears in instruments typically described as feminine, solo flute and harp. The ascending C-D-E flat also acts as a musical shorthand throughout the game score, one that McCreary hopes would induce a Pavlovian response in the player, where they recall all other moments where the theme is heard. The ascending motive not only appears in Kratos' theme, but is a key part of the melody for Faye's theme. The second phrase of Faye's theme begins with D-E-F, the same whole-half pattern that makes up the core of Kratos' theme. So intertwined are Kratos and Faye's themes that during Kratos' moments of personal development, his theme changes from C minor to D minor, the same as Faye's theme. The changing key reflects Kratos beginning to accept his past. When paired with the wide range of instruments used to play his theme, we see a change in Kratos' masculinity based on being a self in relation. In this way, Kratos' newfound, if still flawed masculinity arises because of his relationship with his wife and child.
And here I thought your kind was supposed to be so enlightened, so much better than us, so much smarter. And yet you hide out here in the woods like a coward.
God of War's primary antagonist, Baldur, serves as a mirror to Kratos, exhibiting many of the same toxic traits that Kratos did in the Greek trilogy. Musically, this is reflected in the relationship between Kratos and Baldur's theme. Kratos' theme begins with a 3-note whole half ascent, C, D, E flat, while Baldur's begins with a 3-note half whole descent, G flat, F, E flat. While Kratos' theme generally ascends and develops melodically, Baldur's theme remains relatively static, bouncing between E flat minor and C minor harmonies. In Norse mythology, Baldur is invulnerable to all forms of harm except mistletoe, which is further reinterpreted in God of War to mean that he cannot feel touch or experience a wide range of emotions. In its place, a toxic masculinity grows where Baldur can only express rage and resentment, eventually leading to his downfall. The semiotics of gameplay involves the player's interaction with the video game and its music. The player creates meaning through an interactive poiesis, where their own personal significations interact with the various game elements which may or may not line up with the intended aesthesis of the semiotics of initial composition. Hartt describes the continuous interactions of outside texts and significations with the game as the post-aesthetic influence. These kinds of epi and peritexts come in many forms, from tie-in comics and novels, to fan forums, to other academic writings on God of War. There are several personal experiences and significations that influence my interpretation of God of War. Perhaps out of all of them, the most important personal significance is my own past struggles with anger management and toxic masculinity. My dad's family has a long history of hard-to-control tempers, and throughout my teenage years I struggled to get a control of mine, often leading to moments of despair when I failed. While I've gotten much more control over it and have been seeking help for well over a decade, there are still moments where I slip and fall back into that toxic mindset. Escaping from one's own internalized toxicity is rarely a straightforward process. It's continuous, and sometimes even our best intentions can lead to toxic decisions. While the gameplay of God of War still falls into common performances of violent masculinity, aspects of the game's design and musical score recontextualize these performances. In a digital comic released before the game, Kratos leaves on a solitary journey trying to gain control of his rage. Time and time again he fails, falling into an existential crisis. Kratos' inability to control his rage leads him to teach Atreus how to live as a disciplined warrior. Many of Kratos' initial lessons to Atreus center on hegemonic masculine attributes, competitiveness, aggression, and a lack of empathy and emotion. Atreus, however, is highly empathetic and wears his emotions on his sleeves. Furthermore, his godly abilities center around the self in relation, a masculinity born out of openness to the other as opposed to its domination. In previous God of War games, Kratos rarely strays from his set path, only moving off it to pillage items and upgrades, as well as to increase his strength, seeing them as distractions otherwise.
So, I guess we should keep an eye out for other spirits.
What did I say about distractions?
But it sounds like they needed help.
They are spirits, boy. Dead things. They have no needs, only wants.
It feels wrong to ignore them.
We will get over these feelings.
We've got to find the other two and free them.
It does not concern us.
I know, but it's what Mother would have wanted. And it just seems right.
Guard your emotions, boy. Your enemies will not hesitate to use them against you. Listen to me. To be effective in combat, a warrior must not feel for his enemy. The road ahead is long and unforgiving. No place for a boy. You must be.
In addition to the debate between side questing to help yourself and side questing to help others, many of these side quests have narratives dealing with wayward spirits who are victims of toxic masculinity in one way or another. As the game progresses, we can see Kratos start to change his understanding as a self in relation as opposed to a hypermasculine self alone. As a final example, we will examine the scene at the end of the confrontation with Baldur, where Kratos has given him a second chance to give up his quest for revenge against Freya. As Baldur is strangling Freya, we hear his theme in the high strings in C minor, leading into a sustained A7 sharp 9 sharp 13 as Kratos pulls him off of her.
Why do you even care? You could have walked away.
warrior must be better than this.
It is here that Kratos falls back into his toxic self and snaps Baldur's neck, ending one cycle of violence by starting another. The brassing choir singing Kratos' full theme in F minor initially seems triumphant, but quickly the score descends into one of tragedy as Freya swears revenge on Kratos and Atreus.
No, my boy! My dear sweet boy!
Freya. He chose this.
I will rain down every agony, every violation imaginable upon you. I will parade your cold body from every corner of every realm and feed your soul to the vilest filth in hell. That is my promise.
He saved your life.
He robbed me of everything. Everything. You were just an animal. Passing on your cruelty and rage, you will never change.
And you do not know me.
Her theme is played by horns as she declares them both animals that can never change. For the most part, horns have been reserved solely for masculine characters and themes, namely Kratos and Baldur. The transference of Freya's theme to the horns reflects how Kratos' reversion into his past toxic behavior has consequences. Musically, this cycle of violence is heard in the strings underpinning Freya's theme, as well as the use of 12/8 time. The accompaniment also features Kratos' 3-note motive, showing how getting revenge for killing Baldur is now a driving force in Freya's existence, continuing the cycle of toxic violence. As Kratos reveals the truth of his past to Atreus, we hear the 3-note version of his theme play in D minor in the low strings. The high female choir singing Kratos' theme between the lines, "Many who are deserving, and many who are not," is a rare occurrence. This implies that while still limited, Kratos' empathy and understanding of his actions have grown.
Boy, listen close. I'm from a land called Sparta. I made a deal with the god that cost me my soul. I killed many who were deserving, and many who were not. I killed my father.
That was your father in hell. Is this what it is to be a god? Is this how it always ends? Sons killing their mothers? Their fathers?
No. We will be the gods we choose to be, not those who have been. Who I was is not who you be. We must be better.
Playing over to this scene is Faye's theme, not Kratos'. It is curious that out of all the main characters, Atreus is the only one not to have a specific theme. Perhaps Faye's theme can be equally viewed as Atreus' theme, as he becomes the embodiment of her beliefs and ideals over the course of the game. Despite many admirable strides and meditations on the consequences of toxic masculinity, God of War stumbles in a few respects. Masculinity largely remains privileged over femininity, and this rehabilitation falls within the masculine-feminine binary. As the final example has also shown, Kratos has not fully redeemed himself or overcome his deeply rooted toxic masculinity, and the developers' focus on ideas of masculinity often comes at the detriment to the few women characters in the game. In their thesis, Redeeming the Monster, the God of War subreddit's narrative of rebirth for hegemonic masculinity, Mario Sanders uses the social media website Reddit as a location of virtual ethnography to examine 3 constructed narratives that both support and defend Kratos' second chance from feminist critique. While Reddit certainly isn't representative of gaming culture holistically, it provides a look into a slice of the community that tends towards toxic interaction. On its own, God of War is a flawed but important step in game design practice towards deconstructing the hypermasculine gamer. Its performances of masculinity are recontextualized from the hypermasculine self alone to the more benign self in relation through the use of its narrative and gameplay, mediated by the musical score. It asks men to interrogate their lack of empathy and control over rage, and provides a first step towards rehabilitation, because without first understanding hegemonic masculinity, we will be unable to fully dismantle it.